Iranian strikes have been reported across the Middle East, sharply escalating tensions in the region. In Saudi Arabia, officials say a fire at an oil refinery is now under control following what's believed to be an Iranian attack. Meanwhile, Gulf states and the United States have issued a joint statement condemning what they call Iran's indiscriminate and reckless missile and drone attacks. The latest violence comes after Israel and the U.S. carried out attacks on Iran on Saturday, killing Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iranian authorities are now warning residents not to gather or protest in the streets. In Kuwait, the military says several U.S. fighter jets have crashed. One of them was caught on video plummeting to the ground. The cause is under investigation, but Kuwait released a statement just moments ago that it was mistakenly fired by its own forces. It was a friendly fire. Now, Israel airstrikes have also hit Beirut, killing at least 31 people. According to Lebanon, Lebanon State News Agency, after Hezbollah said it launched rockets and drones at a military base in Haifa in retaliation. Now, in Cyprus, a British RAF base was reportedly targeted in a suspected drone strike, with families being moved off the base. This is a fast-moving and widening conflict across the region. Let's now bring you a timeline of talks and threats leading up to the current crisis. All right, we'll bring you that timeline in just a moment, but let's bring in our guest as we sort of just look at the escalating tension and conflict now, not tension anymore, in the Middle East. For more on this development, I'm joined by Professor of International Law, Ademola Abbas, and Global Affairs Analyst, Collins Oweke, who joins me. All right, so we will let's speak to our guest who joins me from Brussels, Belgium. Good to have you both join us.
Thank you. Francis, precious for having me.
All right, so I will have, we would bring you in just a moment, but we want to just take the timeline of all that has happened from threats leading up to the current crisis. Now, from January this year, despite several rounds of indirect U.S.-Iran negotiations aimed at curbing Tehran's nuclear program, tensions steadily rose, culminating in Saturday's U.S. and Israeli military offensive against Iran, the most intense escalation since the June 2025 conflict. All right, let's speak to our guest now. Prof, I want to start with you. That's Professor Ademola Abbas. I want to start with you. Interestingly, this started with the negotiations. There was a strike last year as well, but then there were negotiations and everyone thought that, look, this was heading in the right direction. Both sides looked like they were looking to use diplomatic tactics or strategy in resolving this crisis. But there was a strike on Saturday, and in between Saturday and today, Monday, it has escalated across the region. I just want to get your reaction to that escalation we're seeing now in the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much, Precious, and thanks for having me again. Yeah, as you said, there was a negotiation process. As we saw last year, we had negotiations between US and Iran, brokered by Oman and some other countries. In the middle of the negotiation, there was an attack on Iran last year. That's about June, thereabout. And again, of recent, a couple of months ago, another round of negotiation started with Oman mediating. And, again, there was a ramp up from America that Iran should come to the table, and Iran said they were coming to the table, they will negotiate and so on and so forth. Right in the middle of that, again, a couple of days ago, that's on Saturday, we had a joint strike by the United States and Israel targets within Iran, of course, which then led to a retaliation from Iran. But what is important, though, Precious, is a retaliation by Iran this time around is not confined to the United States or to Israel, the two countries that have attacked it, but it widened that, to the entirety of the Gulf states. Majorly, you're talking about the UAE, you're talking about Qatar, you're talking about Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And the question is, why is Iran doing that? Why is that? You must understand that the US has a lot of facilities and amenities in those countries, infrastructure, military bases in some of the countries, and so on and so forth. I think where we are today, I'm happy you're no longer talking about escalation because we have a full-blown war now. The question is, what does that do to the Middle East now? What does it do to the entirety of the region? When you understand clearly that you fight in Iran, and Iran is not Iraq when it comes to the widespread of Iranian networks of support. What you're talking about, you might say, well, you've already decimated or you've depreciated the capacity of Hamas now because of the war in Gaza. Well, you still have the Hezbollah there in Lebanon, you have the Houthis, in Yemen. So you have
absolutely, Prof. And we've seen the reaction.
Elements of Hamas still showing solidarity and coming across the borders to be able to join.
And Prof, we've seen Hezbollah reacting.
Hezbollah is very, very present, or the Houthis rebels in Yemen, and so it's quite, what is going on today is palpable, and nobody can call it. Although the Americans have been saying, "Oh, we're talking about 3 to 4 weeks here." Well, Russia never thought that it was going to lose more than.
All right, Prof, I was trying to put you on hold, but it looks like the network has, achieved that. But let me bring Collins Awake into the conversation. Prof was talking about how this is no longer, we've seen the widespread, conflict and the bombing by Iran across the region. They say that they're targeting U.S. Interests and bases in that region. But let's talk about the legality of this war, Mr. Weke, and whether or not, because there seems to be the idea, Gulf states have reacted to Iran's bombing, of U.S. interests in their countries, and they are saying, look, we might be forced to use military strikes as well. Does Iran also have the right to protect itself? That's the question I was going to ask, and the legality of the war.
What we're seeing here is tit for tat. Like the saying goes, an eye to an eye leaves everybody blind. So we're hoping that through the well-known, well-respected diplomatic strategies, that the entire world will not be left blind with all the tit for tat. But of course, it's expected. Now, to your question about international law. Well, under international law, force is lawful only in self-defense against an imminent attack or with UN Security Council approval. Now, the US and Israel, they argue preemptive self-defense. Yeah, listen to that, preemptive self-defense, okay? The controversy is whether the threat was truly imminent. If powerful states stretch the definition of imminence, the rules-based order actually gets weakened, not actually, helped. Now, because international law is meant to restrain power, especially, powerful states, if the rules are flexible for the strong, they become meaningless for the weak. A country like Nigeria that actually, relies on those rule-based order, middle powers, when it is left loose, they stand to lose. So the rules-based order only works if the rules bind the powerful too. Now, the question is, has the rule-based order binded the United States and Israel, two powerful nations? It doesn't look like it. And, that is that creates a whole lot of, vulnerability for the middle powers and the weak nations.
So, okay, Iran is also coming from, prosecuting this war from a place of losses. I was reading your article, and one of the things that caught my attention was the killing of the Ayatollah and what it means for the psychology, of Iran going into this war. And I wanted to speak to that before we bring Prof back to the conversation.
Yeah, well, when you come to a situation where, the head of a nation is targeted for assassination, it does have, far-reaching implication. Assassinating a sitting supreme leader is geopolitically seismic. Internally, it could consolidate hardliners in Iran and intensify nationalistic sentiments. Succession politics may become even more rigid and, not more reformist. Now, there was a talk, there was, some sort of expectation given the, election of a president in Iran that could be considered to a large extent to be a reformist. Now, what happens with the assassination of the supreme leader is that the reformist pathway will most likely give way to, hardline, kind of politics. So succession politics may become more rigid, not more, reformist, like I said, and then externally, it raises dangerous precedent. If leadership targeting, becomes normalized, no political figure in conflict zones feels immune. That lowers the threshold for future, escalation globally. Because come to think of it, Precious, if Putin, having the power, then targets, Vladimir Zelensky and eliminated him, just imagine, what that would have meant. So once leadership becomes a battlefield target, escalation norms quickly erodes. And, just to finalize on that, decapitation, when you remove the decapitation strikes to remove leaders, it also, causes a whole lot of chain reactions. That's the bottom line, really.
All right, so we would take a break now, and then we'll return. We would get back to the conversation. Stay with us, everyone. All right, Prof, I want to be sure that we have you now. We lost connection with you. All right, great. Prof, I wanted to ask you, because just a few moments ago, we listened to Defense Secretary, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who said that the war against Iran is not comparable to the Iraq war. He also added that the United States will not be caught in the same nation-building quagmire that it found itself 2 decades ago. What level of damage do you think the U.S. and Israel are trying to reach in Iran before they withdraw?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very, very pivotal question, because at this stage, it's pretty difficult to actually determine what Hegseth was saying. It's too early in the day to determine whether this is another Iraq or not. From 2 points of view, basically. It's not Iraq because you might say, well, you have not alleged that you are going after a discovery of weapon of mass destruction, WMD, which was what the United States alleged that Iraq had already built up as a justification for going into that war. Of course, we knew that eventually there was no smoking gun found in Iraq, despite the noise that was made by Colin Powell, who was there, the Secretary of Defense, and so many of them Joint Chief of Staff, and many of them in the American state. But then you had a very hawkish people in government, Donald Rumsfeld, and so many of that, who thought they should go into Iran, they should go into Iraq, and just because they were going in for regime change, but they had to hide under WMD, which they didn't find. But they were going, obviously, after the Ba'athist government at that point in time. Now, they might say this is different because, as even Jordan said, which was also emphasized a few minutes before you went online, by Hegseth, said that this is not Iraq, because he was saying, look, this is not another regime change government. What he said, to remember that Operation Epic Fury, which they are doing now, has 3 main objectives. Number 1 is to destroy Iranians' conventional umbrella, which is their
It looks like once again we've lost connection with Prof. Prof, I just want to establish connection one more time. All right, let's get to Mr. Wiki. I mean, the tone by Pete Hegseth is quite different from the one, from President Trump on Sunday. who spoke against Iranian retaliation over the US and Israeli strikes. And he said, Prof, just a minute. And he said that if Iran were to hit very hard, they would be met with a force that has never been seen before. So is this a slippery slope? Does this have the ability to escalate even beyond the region?
Certainly. I mean, the world is now used to, hearing Trump speak in so superlatives as absolutely, and so, those extremist superlative. The full world war remains unlikely. I mean, if that's what you alluded to in terms of, escalating beyond the region. But, but it's not impossible, Precious, if major powers miscalculate. Russia has already condemned the strike. China is watching closely. The greater immediate risk is economic. Yeah? That is the one that is immediate. Energy price, spikes, shipping insecurity, market volatility. Those are the ones that are actually on the doorstep as you and I speak. For countries like Nigeria, higher oil prices may bring short-term gains, but global instability, fuels inflation and trade disruption. So regional war rarely stay regional in economic impact. So you may be far from the battlefield, but not far from the consequences. I think that is the underlying factor here. So even if you are not going to be hit by a bullet, economically, it has a way of impacting you. And so, it has a way indeed of trickling down negatively the rest of the world, the rest of the regions outside the Middle East.
And I want to be sure that we have Prof back.
Yeah, here.
Okay, so again, we're talking about the implications of this war escalating beyond the region. In the very wake of in the very heat of a Russia invasion of Ukraine, there were reports of Iranian weapons being found or being used, by Russia in that war. And we know that there are strong ties between Russia and Iran. Russia is calling for de-escalation and condemn the war. But is Russia obligated to support Iran at some point? And would it dare to do that, considering that this is the US we're talking about?
Well, thank you very much. Look, as you've said, Russia has a lot of connection with Iran. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Has a lot of connection with Iran. For instance, Russia has one of its nuclear bases actually inside Iran. And that was why it conveyed, earlier today, the IEA in Vienna to discuss the possibility that might be hit actually. And because Russia wants to guarantee that the nuclear, its nuclear base there would not be hit. But beyond Russia is the fact that also, look at the UK and Europe. We haven't talked too much about Europe. Europe hasn't responded a lot. But UK, first of all, was not going to get involved in it at all. But then it gave, UK gave its permission to US to launch his base in Diego Garcia and also in the island of Cyprus, to give it to US to be able to launch from that, but only for defensive purposes. So in a way, these countries might stealthily find themselves actually getting involved in the war. I don't see the escalation in terms of military confrontation between major nuclear powers like Russia and US and so on and so forth. That is highly unlikely because Russia is very careful today. Russia is stretched thin itself as things were because of what is going on in Ukraine today. But of course, in terms of economy, we're already seeing that the economy is already very jittery. Don't forget that the Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of world oil, and that is right on the on the Gulf of Iran, and Iran is already closing down. There's already a buildup of ships, cargoes on that particular strait, so that's going to send a lot of jitters to the world, basically. And as we talk today, there are almost 400,000 travelers that are stuck in the Middle East. They couldn't fly. UK is just thinking about what to do now to be able to help in evacuating. So escalation might not be in terms of military per se, because something tells me, despite the bravado of Iran, and by the way, Iran has its right to defend itself, because under the UN Charter, Article 51 gives a country a right to self-defense if an actual armed attack occurs against it. An actual armed attack has occurred against Iran. But the truth, though, is whether US and Israel have gone to Iran preemptively, the answer is absolutely not, because to act preemptively, there must be an overwhelming evidence that you are about to be attacked. U.S. has admitted now before the Congress.
And this happened in the middle of a negotiation, Prof. I have just about a minute left, and I wanted to just give about 30 seconds to Collins for his final thought, especially with the reaction of the Gulf states also threatening Iran with a military attack if it continues to attack that countries. Where does that leave Iran in that region? Hezbollah is trying to come in, but Israel seems to be retaliating as well.
Well, by way of wrapping all of this up, Precious, I would say that history teaches us that wars begin with certainty and end with regret. The urgent question now is whether states choose escalation or statesmanship. Now, we are hoping that Europe, where I am, and listening to friends, associates, and colleagues within the institutions of the European Union, what they are looking at is relying on the traditional, powerful European character of pursuing diplomacy as opposed to other means. And I believe that bringing that to the table, it will help to calm situations down so that ultimately, I think the world doesn't have very much to worry about. These are uncertain times, but I think containment is around the corner.
And I wish I had enough time to ask you both whether negotiations are off the table, but we'll see how things play out. Thank you so much for your time. Professor of International Law, Ademola Abbas, and Global Affairs Analyst, Collins Oweke. Pleasure to have you both on.
Always a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
All right, that's What Now. Thank you so much for watching. I am Precious.